Hello and good morning, afternoon and evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this ninth session of 10 webinars. My name is here and you still can call me Hedin. And the reason for my name is because I come from a little island in up north in the hemisphere called Iceland. And today I'm going to again remind you of why we are talking about the International Week of Happiness at Work. Two Dutch ladies in 2018 decided that we need to focus on this subject because, as we everybody know, we spend a lot of time at work and it can have a significant impact on the rest of our lives. So therefore, this week. And I have a treat for you who are listening because not only do I have one person from South Africa, I have two persons from South Africa. And one lives in South Africa, but the other one lives in Holland. So now let's, ladies first, and then the man. So, Anna, Rosa, and Sean, you are both from South Africa, and but you're not living in like South Africa. No, Anna Rosa, you are not living in South Africa.
No, I think I've adopted the second country. I'm living in the Netherlands, and it's called in a small little town on the coast between Amsterdam and The Hague. And for people to find reference, it's very close to Keukenhof, where the tulip paradise of the world is. So I love the community and the closeness to nature, but also the traffic hubs.
Yes, for me, because I'm in Iceland and it takes a lot to travel. When people talk about Holland, I find it always like they can just walk between towns for 20 minutes. Then they have like Amsterdam and Den Haag and whatever. Like it's just like a walking distance, but that's probably not correct. So, Sean, and you are in South Africa.
I am indeed. I'm in Johannesburg in the big city life, which I'd rather not. So Anna Rose is actually from Cape Town, which anyone who wants to visit Cape Town, I would highly advise it. Johannesburg, might want to give it a skip, but I live on the outskirts of the city, out in the greenery, and where life is rather nice. So yeah.
Well, that was a great sales pitch for Johannesburg. Sean. They must be happy with you.
Yeah, no, the tourism board is not paying me for that sales pitch. I can
No,
tell you.
yeah. But before we start, Dr. Anna Rosa, can you just give us a little bit of background and why or what, like I know that maybe we're not talking exactly about happiness at work, but like you are focusing maybe on well-being at work. So just give me a little bit of why is this subject particular for you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Eden. I think for me, it is really about, it's founded in my profession. So for us as psychologists, we believe in the flourishing of people and really about optimizing the potential of our human resources or our people resources in organizations. And I think sort of that's one part, but also from an evidence-based, I'm always saying I'm an evidence-based practitioner. So on the one side, you've got science, but on the other side, you've also got the practice. And I get a lot of energy by translating the science into practice in organizations to create value. Yeah, and the well-being part, it's always, it's a little bit part of my personal philosophy as well, to say, how can one really give the best talents that you have to offer to the world in a very authentic way, and then make an impact, because I think that is purpose and that is what makes life interesting. So very much of my personal philosophy tied into sort of a formal training approach, and sort of also my organization, Work Life Digital, consult. It's a global consulting organization that provides services in the work-life space, and where we focus on individuals, on teams, and organizations. So it's very much looking at an organization from a holistic point of view as well. Yeah, let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, my thought is that Dr. Ana Rosa, you don't look a day older than 22. So, like, did you start when you were 5, becoming a doctor? Was this too much of a compliment?
I will definitely take that compliment. And I'm also saying, since I've left, it's an interesting thing that I've learned about the Dutch society is there's no discrimination with age. So they talk about leeftijd. So what is your leeftijd? It's roughly translated to age, but it's the time that you have lived. And it's not about how old you are. So, and I think that is a very interesting philosophy. It's a completely positive acceptance for any age. And I'm resonating with that. So I love getting older every year because for me, it's about wisdom. You acquire more little nuggets in life.
Brilliant life lesson. So, to the old guy in Johannesburg, Dr. Sean. So, well, it was a good way to talk about it. So, tell us a little bit about you.
So no compliments for me, I see. No, hidden. So I'm also a psychologist, but I think so Ana Rosa is an organizational psychologist. That's her specialization. I specialize more, I think in Europe you call it experimental psychology or research psychology. So, and my PhD was in behavioral economics and psychometrics. But I spent a lot of time working with organizations doing research about people. So whether consumer psychology or internal stuff around staff members or socioeconomic research for governments, that kind of thing. Then I found myself back in the university space, teaching and researching and supervising master's students and doing those things that you do. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, I got tired of all of that and became what Ana Rosa has called a scientist practitioner, which is the term that she and I like to use. So we like to apply principles of science and rigor and so on, but really to a practical outcome. I'm beyond, people use the term, oh, it's purely academic. And I suppose there is some validity to that. In other ways, I mean, we need academia, of course, but I think Ana Rosa and I have made that sort of, that decision to straddle the fence. So use scientific principles, but let's try and make the world a better place for fellow humanoids. And I think some of what we're going to chat about today is some of the research that she and I did about well-being. But maybe it makes sense to logically tie that into your theme of happiness. I was saying to her just the other day that for me, if there's no well-being, there cannot be happiness. You know, it's a precursor to, it's an antecedent of. And if you don't have those basic human principles and respect and decency and kind of psychosocial support, etc., there is just zero chance that happiness will ensue, right? And I think that was really our focus in some of our more recent research. But of course, we've got broader things to talk about as well. So that's it in a nutshell.
But I think this will be, I sense this will be challenging for me. I need to put my shoulders down because I need to keep you on track, not to be too academic. And then, but I think you have answered that you want to be on a speaking to, like, so people understand. You will explain the science in a language that we all understand. And that is important because there can't be this cliff between academias and, I was going to say normal people.
That's ugly.
So so this will be exciting and talking about the topic. So we are going to dive into workplace well-being and what it looks like in 2024, because you made a study and you will talk about, like, maybe what was the highlight, what was the thing that most surprised you, if there was any, and maybe, I don't know, because when you were talking, Sean, all of a sudden I thought, what about the fear in the world? All the bad stuff that is happening, how can that influence our well-being, our happiness, because there is so much negativity in the world. So who wants to start about what you did and why you like? Did you do it both in Holland and in South Africa, or like? Take it away, babes.
Ladies first.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe just the business case, or asking the big why. Why did we ever approach on a study like this? And I think I love to ask the why questions. And I think both Sean and I, and specifically tying to what you've been saying, is the world is stressed out. And we can see that on a lot of statistics. And I'm going to just refer to some of the statistics to start setting the scene. And then I'll give hand over to Sean. And what we know is sort of the generational trauma. We know, and statistics that I'm looking for here, it's statistics that was been published by Gallup, and there's 31% of adults that's younger than 35 report they're not thriving, and that is down with more than 5% from the previous years. Versus adults older than 35, it's the other way around. And this is in a 2024 Global Workplace Report from Gallup. So number one, we found that the younger generation has lost purpose. They asking for a reconnect. They've got very different sort of value systems implementing and different asks in organizations. So that's the one thing. And just globally, what we see is the stress levels are a historic high. And also corporate organizations are spending a lot of money. And the number that I've got here is 52 billion in 2022 alone. And that is a historic low, but we're not seeing that the stress levels are sort of decreasing. We're not seeing an improvement. And what we're seeing from the stats is employees are the most unhealthiest and unhappiest, as per Gallup, that they've ever been. And therefore, both Sean and I are saying, but organizations can make a big impact, because as you said earlier as well, there's a lot of things that organizations can influence. And there's also a ripple effect with organizations and the leadership role on employees, on the wife, on the husband at home, on the children, on the grandparents. So we see the value of that investment in workplace well-being to hold significant benefits to organizations. And I think that's really where Sean and I said, but let's put our organizational scientific practitioner hat on and let's go and interview people. And Sean, let me hand over to you just to kickstart the study from there.
Yeah, no problem. I'll just give the overview. He didn't ask us not to be overly scientific, so let's make it easily digestible. So essentially, we did a qualitative approach. So it was not mixed, it was not quantitative, it was qualitative. What we did is we conducted or we engaged in purposive sampling. Basically, that means we cherry picked who we wanted to speak to, key informants, right? So we spoke to organizational psychologists, we spoke to certified coaches, ICF certified, those sorts of people. We spoke to human resources executives, we spoke to HR consultants, and we spoke to academics. Okay, and we said, what is the state of things? What is required for well-being to be in place? And of course, there was an in-depth interview guide and so on. And what we did was we then, in a fairly what they call conventional content analysis, but we really thematized our findings, okay? And this is where I come back to what I said to you, where I think what we came up with would be considered, in my view, the precursors to happiness. And we did touch on some of the areas that you mentioned around the negativity in the world as well. But of our 8 themes, and I think maybe we'll unpack them in more detail in a moment, but I'll just list them quickly. The first was psychological safety. So that's one that's on the tip of many people's tongues at the moment, but it's how safe do I feel to be my authentic self, right? The next one is transformational leadership. So to what extent does my leader embody the values that we would like to see in the organization? How much genuine care is there? And then onto what you were saying about the more negative stuff, a wonderful term that in my podcast, I'm actually going to dedicate a whole session to, which one of the executive coaches came up with and called it trauma-based leadership, all right, which is essentially taking into account the traumas that a human being experiences and showing empathy, okay, and being aware of those traumas. Now, I think we live in a world that's never been more upside down with global conflict and politics, and whether it might be rates of crime or people still reeling coming out of COVID or personal issues, health issues, sick children, whatever it might be. I'm personally aware of an event that took place this week where someone was diagnosed with, I believe it was thyroid cancer, and they had to go for a surgery, and they got hold of their boss and said, this is the case. And the first reaction the boss had was, okay, when are you back at work? Okay. Now, that is not trauma-based leadership. This is a person who may or may not be facing their own mortality. And the boss's concern is, when will you be back to productivity? Now, that's not how you retain people. That's not how you show basic respect. And we've been able to show that there is a bottom line effect here as well. It's not all just rainbows and panda bears and butterflies. Okay. Happiness, respect, decency at work results in better financial results. The third thing we found is what we called transcendence. But basically, am I bigger than the job I'm doing? And the answer is almost always yes. But how do you help a person to feel larger than the job they're doing? How do they transcend in their own cognitive state what they're doing? And it doesn't matter if they are working reception or they're an intern or they're the CFO or whatever. How do they plug into the whole in a way that makes them feel greater than just being that single node? The fourth one was empathy, more of a generalized sense of empathy, not sympathy, but empathy. Fourth, we found valuing people, or having an unconditional value for people more than anything else, is actually constructive for business. Not worrying about your raw materials, not worrying about your balance sheet, not worrying about whatever all that other stuff is. Yes, that stuff's important. But if you put your people first, those other things fall into place, because those people start to care about those things more than you as a leader actually have to. And you can actually start relying on your people instead of having your fingers in all the pies at once. We found that personalized support is a big deal. That was the sixth one. The seventh one, and you mentioned one of the previous podcasts about belonging, we found that identity was a big deal, where we can frame it as the individual versus the us. Now, if that individual can slot into a greater, if they can put a banner over their head saying, I am part of ABC organization, proudly so, that leads to a great sense of well-being. And then the final one was continuous growth and sense making. So if I have the opportunity to be more and do more and feel more, and it need not be on an hourly or daily basis, but if that sort of carrot is dangled there, it offers hope. And there's the great quote that the only thing stronger than fear is hope. And I do subscribe to that quotation. And so in a nutshell, that's really what we found. And for me, if those things aren't in place, then all of your podcasts about happiness are going to fall flat, because we need those things in place. Happiness is almost like it's the cherry on top. It's the final, it's the capstone that we need to build on the pyramid of everything else that our research showed, in my view. But I've said a lot there, so let me pause. Yeah.
But let me just, I want to ask, with a guy with a thyroid cancer, the response, can it be shock from the leader? Because sometimes when you get disturbing news, you don't know what to say, and you just then you say something that sounds stupid, or it's just, oh, my mother died today. Oh yes, I was in the cinema yesterday. It's just something totally opposite, and it's just huh? Because people, sometimes we are not trained to respond to that kind of news. And cancer is one of those, when I was growing up, cancer and the Cold War was the biggest for me. I was just I was terrified of it. And the second thing is, you can just a quick one. The different, when you are making such research, because all the people you mentioned, is there a difference between people who have a long history of school and academias and stuff, and then the people who have only elementary school? I don't know if it sounds ridiculous, the question, but have you experienced, because you have probably made thousands of stuff because in your research and stuff. Is there a difference in answering when people have more school background than less? Do you know? Do I make sense? Like Anna,
Yeah.
you not
Yeah, I'm
with
thinking,
your hand. Like
yeah, if
did you?
you answering that question, for me, it's very much about two components inherent in ourselves, and one is the being part and the doing part. So we've often spoke about leaders that does a lot. It's about driving leadership strategy. It's about driving vision. But then there's also a being part, and I think the being part is what Sean was talking about. You're sort of re-embodying the values of the organization, but it's also people don't follow leaders if it's just the intellectual component, if it's just the doing part. There's such an important, and I want to call it a human connection point of view by just being. And I must say, I've done a lot of consulting in the rest of the African component as well. And I often tell the story to people sort of coming back to the boardrooms of corporate business in South Africa. I really thought I'm misplaced here because I've experienced something in Africa or the rest of Africa that was a lot of being. You are accepted by just the fact that you're showing up as a human being. And I'm wondering if in our Western thought, we haven't lost that important part of being human. And we've got caught up into profit. We've been caught up into sort of the bottom line, but at the cost of the sustainability, at the cost of the balance, at the cost of really resonating with that human being. What does it take to be human? And I think sort of certainly some of my philosophy, and I know Sean is sharing that, what do we need to do to create workplaces that does both, that actually attends to the human part, the being part, but also the doing part? And I think with this example as well, how do we give that psychological safe space that you don't have to do anything, you are accepted for the fact that you are a human being, and then the profit and the performance and all of that will come. But there's a step before that I'm wondering if we haven't forgotten in our westernized societies.
I think I'll just add to that, just to answer Hidden's first question, where he said, there's the shock value of bad news and so on. But I would challenge that assertion, because I would say that very same leader, if their daughter, let's say, phoned them and said, I've got cancer, I'm going for surgery, would that leader turn around and say, oh, well, good luck. Are you still going to make it to Sunday lunch? No.
Yeah,
Okay.
no,
Now, that's effectively what that person is doing to their own people. Now, you've got an employee who's lying in a hospital bed worrying about their job, or worrying about how quickly they can recover, or whatever it might be. I mean, it's insane, but it is so common. And that is how to build your organization on the sand. All right. We talk AI for days in the current world, and I've really gone backwards and forwards in AI, and I've frankly been rather disappointed in it. And there is no replacement for your humanoids, as much as some would like to replace their humanoids. There is not. And if you're treating them poorly, you're going backwards. Anna Rosa and I have done a lot of sort of practical research as well on these sorts of matters. And you are not bound for success if the only thing you've ever looked at is your income statement. It's just not going to be good. And if it is the only thing you look at, and we look at some of these big investment banks and things like that, and one would say they're successful. By what metric, though? Okay, the metric would be financially. Sure. If we delve deeper, we have employees with drug problems so that they can work 20-hour days. We've got employees who are burning out. We've got people who are unhappy. We've got marriages breaking down. We've got people who never see their children. I mean, it is an absolute smorgasbord of everything you don't want to see, except the balance sheet looks great, but is that the world we want to live in? And I think that's what I would say in response to your first question. Yeah.
When in this week, all of the sessions that I have had, I don't know why Henry Ford came. He has been really on my mind. Henry Ford, the car dealer in the US, when the only thing the factory workers, they had to do was to show up, work, go home, nothing else. And if you, from an organizational point of view, how far have we evolved? Is there humanity? Where are we? Like, we have gone through some wavelengths of changes, and I don't know like the words for it, but like, Anna, do you have any take? Like, have you looked at how it has evolved, and is humanity a part of it, or is it, because you mentioned before the values and the norms? How are you brought up? What are you bringing to the table as a leader, maybe? And your values is maybe work, shut up, go home, to be frank. So your take on that, like, is that something that you can see in your studies?
Yeah, and I think what you're referring to is the Henry Ford, is the old classical approach, almost at the start of the initiation of our field of study. First time that psychologists are actually entering business organizations, and that was a very early study that we refer to as scientific management. But I think that worldview is, we're seeing computers as sort of it's a machine and it can be controlled. And then later on, there's theories of complexity and of chaos, and sort of systems are moving, and it is much more inclusive, where the human being are seen as a critical resource, part of this organizational system. And also, if you create value, you need to sort of resonate with the purpose of the organization. And there's another famous saying to say, but I don't want to leave a piece of myself at home in the garage. I want to actually
Oh la la. You dropped off, so you want to take the famous quote, or what you were saying, starting saying? Yeah.
I wanted to say that I don't want to leave a piece of myself at home in the garage. I want to bring my whole self to the office, and
Oh la
I
la.
want to actually give my talent. And there's a lot of psychological things that I need to put in place, and we often call the psychological contract as well. So, where do I belong? How do I belong in the organization? And that's a lot of identity. So, who am I as a human being in this organization? And we're seeing a lot of the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging sort of literature playing out in this space, that everybody needs to belong and want to belong, because only if I belong, I can resonate and I can feel part of the organization. Second one is purpose. How do I buy into the purpose and the overall vision of the organization? And then lastly, how am I enabled by my managers to connect all the dots and to utilize, for my manager to see my strengths and my skills and what I'm really good at? And we've seen a lot of jobs that are actually being created for individuals based on where they are good at. And that leads to a lot of high performance in organizations. So I think there's a shift in terms of the old scientific management to seeing human beings as potential, and how do we look at the holistic individual, and how will that translate into value for a corporate organization, but also for the individual. So it's almost like this trade-off: what is good for the self and what is good for the organization, and how do we merge these two? So it's probably also a more mature ethical component that we see in organizations, and that leads to sustainability. It's win-win.
But may I add to that quickly? I think there's also something, if you talk Henry Ford, I mean, we can also liken it to, I don't know, the coal mine. You know, you send all these people down a coal mine, dangerous work, where you give them a few coins, and in exchange they must be grateful. You know, like that is such an old school thinking. But since then, obviously, we've moved through socialism and capitalism, and people refer to neoliberalism and all these fancy terms. But for me, the bottom line is, can we legislate happiness and well-being? And I think the answer is no. So we live in a world today where governments have workers' rights, and we have unions, and we have sub-minimum working conditions, etc. But if you're an organization that's really doing the absolute bare minimum to avoid ending up in a labor court, then, like, sorry, no, that's not the requirement for well-being, and then in turn happiness. So I think, you know, just to add to what Ana Rosa was saying, my belief is that ticking compliance boxes is not useful. We need to actually have that level of humanism in place, and not, I mean, it doesn't really matter what the European Council or wherever you live, what their legislation is. I think we all know what common decency is as well. Yeah.
Bit, if you maybe, yeah. Well, Sean and Anna, what I was thinking when you were talking about this now is the leader has to be. We have Generation Z, we have baby boomers and what not, and then you have, and it's, I think we can establish that every company over 150 is starting to get more complicated than a company of 20 or 50 or 70. Fear-based leadership, like the leader must be superhuman, or like how is this possible? Like, why do we then make big companies? Or okay, I know that was sounded really stupid, but that's me. It's early morning, but like, how can we not, like, just how is this? Because you have to be superhuman and you have to know stuff. You have to know so many things to understand and to not react in a bad way. Any take on that? In like, when you look at research and stuff, like, it's just complicated. It must be complicated to like be a leader, and as we well know, we don't have any schools for leaders. You are just handpicked. Oh, use your good promise. You could be a great leader, and then 10 other people, they stand up and say, why did you pick him? I am like, and then they'll be like, do you know what I'm getting at? So if you could address that, maybe start with you, Sean, now.
Yeah, no problem. So I think
a lot of things I mentioned, so you have to like.
No, that's fine. I think in the first instance, it's worth mentioning, and this sounds like a gratuitous marketing, but it's not. What we're doing is we're taking our research with our 8 principles and we're actually turning it into a consulting workshop that we're taking to market through a global group of executive coaches. And essentially, of those 8 principles, we are finding ways to engender them as practice. Okay, so when you say there's no leadership school, I mean, yes, there are pockets and bits and pieces, but we would actually like to try to turn this into an adopted culture. And it doesn't have to change the existing culture of the organization significantly. It's not a 180. It's more accepting this further human-centric kind of idea. But to address your intergenerational claim, so again, on my podcast, I actually had that as a theme quite recently with 2 coaches, one in London and one in Cape Town, and they're both running the same business. And I posed this question to them, and they were vehement in their response. They said, we talk about safe spaces and woke people and snowflakes, and we've got all these kind of derogatory terms. But they said, look, none of this is particularly true. I mean, sure, there might be outliers, but what we're doing is we're not understanding where the different generations are coming from. So we've got the sort of baby boomer mindset, who are generally going to be our executive committee, as an example, in most organizations, where the mindset is one of, but I'm paying you a salary, therefore you will. But the younger generation coming through are saying, well, yeah, the salary is great, but can you actually, is there some common decency or respect here as well? Can I actually, going back to some of our principles and stuff like, can I actually emancipate myself from what I'm doing? Can I transcend from just the day-to-day nothingness? Can I get a sense of identity from this organization? And what we see is that once you do offer them this, they're not a problem, and to label them a problem off the bat is to avoid finding a solution. It's very easy to label people. Oh, look at that snowflake in their safe space. No. That's not helpful at all. And it's not going to bridge any form of divide between the generations. And I don't think there really is such a great divide. I just think that the younger generation are just, by their very ethos, the very zeitgeist within which they advance through the world, are much better social scientists and much more in tune with themselves than the older generation. many of whom did, let's say, military service, and it was all very macho, and it's still a sort of man's world, and 50, 60, 70-year-old men kind of running things in a dogmatic fashion, where that need not be the case. And I don't think that it's actually such a big focal point, that intergenerational thing. I don't know if I answered all of your questions there, but yeah.
Oh, you mentioned great points. Like Dr. Like Anna, do you have any like additional info, or because I'm just thinking about it must be exciting for you, Anna, to come from South Africa and then you're living in Holland. Like it's like you are in the opposite side of the world, or like how do you experience this in your business?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think one of the things that sort of I always look at the Holland, and I'm looking at the social. It's what I frame it as a social democracy. So there's a lot of high functioning. There's a lot of systems, procedures. Everything is functioning. Versus South Africa is developing. So it's also an innovation and a crucible for quickly pioneering new practices. In Holland, for instance, and I've just read this article, and I think it's part of the employee value proposition as well. Practices like selling your leave to your grandparents or to your sort of babysitter. And I think those sort of innovative practices are much more likely sort of in a stable society like the Netherlands. And I think I found the research themes absolutely fascinating. Just that's one example. And just back to this concept of the return on investment versus the value of investment. And I think what we see, let's say in Dutch society, I see a lot of at universities, for instance, research themes emerging that goes beyond the typical return on investment. So it's not only about the profitability of the organization, but it's what we're calling the value impact. What is the value that we're creating in society? And I think a lot of that South Africa has led previously by way of the haves and the have-nots and the divide. And we all know that the Gini coefficient in South Africa is the highest in the world. So therefore, for organizations to be seen sustainable and a license to operate, it was almost legislated that you have to have a social impact component engineered in your organization. And I found that interesting, sort of both in South Africa, but also in the Netherlands. It's the same components, the need for value impact, the need to make a difference in society. So it is converging eventually. But having said that as well, with the new generations, I think there's a lot of hope coming in because it's a new value system that resonates with that social impact, the value. People don't necessarily want to work the 120 hours anymore. It is about families. It is about work-life integration. It's about having a sport. It's about the impact. It's about building digital business. Leveraging economies of scale. So there's a lot of opportunities in the modern workplace that we can learn from the different generations. So I think it's this melting pot of integrating the difference that we see. And maybe they are not so far apart. Maybe it is sort of resonating with the values. What does each generation bring to the workplace that's unique and that we can leverage from? That makes sense.
Totally. Like it is just like we were both like yeah. We were nodding our heads. But yesterday I was talking to Rich Sheridan, and he was talking about the legacy of Menlo Innovations. I don't know if you know his story, where like he based his company. He wanted to base his company on the vision of joy, like you should be happy to work there and give back and stuff. And I was talking about how his legacy could go to other companies. And he mentioned a company, a 180-year-old insurance company. And as you mentioned, Sean, that must only be all about money. And people were like, they wanted to do something. And they had his talk. And then 6 months later, he got back to them, or they got back to him, invited him in. And he was so surprised, so amazed when he asked, okay, what did you do? They said to him, yeah, well, when you come down to the people's, like the persons who are taking the calls, you will see a lot of helium balloons. And he was just like, what? I never talked about helium balloons. And the difference was, and when he talked, like the helium balloon meant that the person in the cubicle was experimenting. And you could come and talk to that person about, okay, what are you doing? And he went into a cubicle and talked to this lady who said that she was just like counting the hours, the minutes, when can I retire? This is dead boring. I hate this job. Whereas she went to do stuff, to try stuff, to make her job better. Everything changes. So how much is it in your research? Like when the job, how can we tell leaders, or do we tell companies, you have to trust your employees that they will figure out. They have brains. They are not people who just come in and they are not typewriters or whatever. Like, again, Sean, your take on this, because it's just, or Anna, like either one of you, just jump in.
Yes, one of my things about this, I don't think we actually have reliable numbers on it, and maybe it's a controversial statement, but there are considerable levels of narcissism in corporate, particularly in corporate. And a lot of these phenomena that you discuss, they appear to come down to power and control. So the more I can exert power and the more I can exert control over other, human beings, the more powerful I can feel, the more my ego can inflate. Now, I know from personal experience, I worked in an environment before where I was measured against timesheets. Okay, so I would have to fill in a timesheet upon arrival and fill in a timesheet upon leaving. And God help you if you didn't work your 8 or 9 hours, whatever it was. And the systems of control were quite literally insane. Okay, they were. And so much so that that's actually what drove me to start my own business. And to be fair, I think I'm doing better now than I've ever done, not just financially, but in general. But you see, if that organization had nurtured my entrepreneurial and innovative capacities and not put me on timesheets and other things that I won't even go into, they would actually be benefiting, because I probably would have remained in sheltered employment and my innovations would have become their intellectual property and they would have proliferated in turn. So yeah, that's just a personal perspective on it. But I do think from what I've seen, Hidden, you working with some of the instruments that I've built, and you're one of the accredited coaches. And what we've seen across the world is that the higher up the organization you go, the more some of those, what we call dark triad personalities, seem to be found. And those would be your psychopaths, your Machiavellians, and your narcissists. And psychopathy is not the technical term; it's antisocial personality disorder and so on. But regardless, you know what I mean. It's really those darker personalities who rise to the top. They usually eventually get found out, but not before they cause considerable destruction to the organization. And more often than not every single time, I think, but more often than not, when you see those incredible systems of, as we say, control, timesheets, how long is the person sitting in their cubicle for, how long was their break taken for. If a leader is focused on those sorts of things, then my question is, what in the world is the leader actually doing? Because if you're a strategist and you're worried about how many minutes someone was in a cubicle for, well, you're not a strategist, you're a narcissist. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that I think is the reality. But I think the more that we become attuned to it, and I think the more the world adopts people like Ana Rosa to come in and actually reform things like organizational design. And she and I are working on an organogram at the moment for an organization. And all these sorts of things, I think the more we can weed out those sorts of undesirable behaviors. Yeah, sorry, that was a long response, but I think that's really where we're at in my mind.
Yeah. Ana Rosa, your thoughts about this?
Well, and I'm thinking sort of the leader's role has radically changed from, and we all know, from a planning and controlling type of role to defining, nurturing, and allocating. And I think that opens up the creativity of your human resources. And it's leaders for me is also about designing culture. So who am I as a leader to come in an organization? Who should I be to create that positive cultures where employees, and earlier what you said about, it's about having voice. How do we create a work environment that every single individual can have a voice in the organization and feel that they belong and being listened to? So I think a lot of the leaders, it's really a change and a shift, and it's a radical change and a shift that leaders needs to make. And forever, as coaches and organizational psychologists and leadership training institutions, we are all working on co-creating this shift to happen. And that shift is one of sort of, it's you enabling your people reporting into you. It's not one of control. It's one of transformational leadership, where you are creating excitement around the vision, but you embodying the values, you embodying the humanity in your workplace. And I was previously involved in a case study in South African mining industry, and there was this particular mine that was they were actually bound to close because they were not making a profit. And they changed their leadership style drastically. They brought a high-profile leader from Africa, and his philosophy was exactly to listen to every voice in the organization, specifically the rock drill operators that are sitting there underground, working night shift, and listening to every single layer in the organization, create actually the holistic picture of the future of the organization. And in terms of the business guys, I mean, they, with 2/3 of the resources, they produce more than double of the previous output. And also in terms of life of mine, from a mine that was doomed to closure, they created another 7 years for potential production in that mine. And that was just because of a transformation in leadership style, to listen to all the information at all the levels in your organization. And I think that was the one observation for me, and also creating that belonging to the overall vision. We're saying, if we are not making this organizational work, I will go home and I will not have food, and the rest of my family will also not have food to eat. So it's actually lobbying behind a vision of the organization that everybody across the board has bought into at a rudimentary and a fundamental level. And I think that is the new vision of organizations. Organizations are co-created. It's not only about the executive, it's about the co-creation through all the levels, and the embodiment and the sort of putting together throughout the organization.
It's funny when you say that, because it's a great example, because Gethin Nadine from Wales in England, he mentioned the hierarchy. And if a leader, you know, the hierarchy, like how it's a triangle, if a leader would step out of that triangle and become a coach, to be on the side and look inwards, then maybe things would also, like, I found it really interesting to think about it that way, that a leader steps out of, it's once in a while, it's really helpful to just step out and look in, instead of always being in the negative, like, oh, they are not doing this and they are not doing this and they are just like lazy bums. And I hope that is not the case.
And I'm going to chip in there, and I think what you've been saying now from a psychological and from a development point of view is so important. So we cannot grow if we don't have the luxury of awareness, and we're calling it awareness. So you literally look at yourself from the outside in. And when you can see yourself more objectively, not subjectively, you won't rationalize your behavior. You are actually open for learning. And that is a magical spot where you can see your own perspective against other perspectives in the organization. So you can see what the rock drill operator sees, or what your executive says, or what your customers are saying, because you're not protecting. And only then can you adjust your perspective by taking the information from the different perspectives, and then you're growing. And I think the self-awareness capability is so fundamental for us to develop our leaders for the future as well, for any learning and development process, any growth process.
Yeah. But how is it? Because we now you came to a point, like I want, maybe I will send it to Sean, because you mentioned growth. Sometimes back in the days, 10 years ago, maybe it was like, if there was something, oh, you have to take a mindfulness course, or you have to go to something. But how is it when you want to grow, or for growth, if you, as a person, as a human being, you have something in your rucksack and you don't deal with it? Like in my case, my father was an alcoholic. If I haven't dealt with the fact, and I always bring up on the table some anger issues, and when people say, oh, you have to relax, why do I have to relax? Like, this explosion or whatever is in me. And if the person doesn't want to, like, how can you grow if you don't want to? Like, how can you acknowledge that you have to, in order to be happy, well-being, then you have to look inside sometimes. It's not only about the leaders, well, it's also about us as employees, because if there is something wrong, sometimes you just have to look in the mirror and say, what is happening here? Your take on that, Sean? Like, I know maybe it's a big question. I don't know, like, did I get ahead of myself? But because your last number was growth in the statement.
Look, I think we have to differentiate between successful leaders and good leaders. Okay, and sometimes we can have both, successful and good. All right. So if we look at, I don't know, people love to quote like Steve Jobs. Okay, was he a successful leader? Yes. Would I have wanted to work for him? No. Okay. And if our theme is happiness, okay, then let's lean towards that, and there are many others I could talk about, and I mean nothing against him. I mean, what an incredibly successful man. But when you're talking about dealing with stuff, I think a lot of successful leaders get to where they are because they actually have a lot of stuff, okay, being issues, being things they want to prove to themselves, things they want to prove to the world. And they're actually not particularly happy people. And not particularly good leaders, but successful ones. Now, what we want to see is the intermeshing between successful leaders and good leaders, okay? And I think that also brings us to, what you were saying about growth. So everybody needs a carrot dangled in front of them, okay? They do. And it doesn't have to be, as we said, on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, but there has to be something that I know I'm working towards. And sometimes, because human beings are not always rational, sometimes that reward doesn't have to be a promotion or financial. It can be praise, okay? Another example is one of the major banks here in my country introduced a very good thing where it's an initiative where it's an annual innovation prize. So anyone in the organization can come together and innovate around whatever it might be, a new product, solution, a new market, a new system, whatever it might be for that bank. And the bank will then put together a panel, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken, and they will sort of assess. And the winning team gets $1 million, like talk about incentive. Okay. And that has paid itself off, 100 times over, 1,000 times over for the organization, because they're listening to people's innovations and they're empowering those innovations. But I think maybe hidden I know the time is running out, but what I wanted to do was, and it does tie into your question, I wanted to actually give you our working definition of workplace well-being based on the research we did. Now, of course, this is well-being, it's not happiness, but again, we position, if there's no well-being, well, then it's going to be tough to find the happiness. And our definition is a little bit of a mouthful, so our watchers might want to rewind, but I'll say it slowly. But based on our research, again, we define modern workplace well-being as psychological safety through transformational leadership, okay, that allows for transcendental workplace experiences, full stop. These experiences take place against the backdrop of empathy for people, valuing people, and personalized support for their needs, okay? Worth scope for personal belonging and continuous growth. Okay, so with that definition, we encompass a lot of the stuff you were talking about, leadership things, a lot of, when you were talking about issues. If an organization has a proper employee assistance program in place, you should be able to make use of that. And not what we were saying before, a tick box compliance minimum requirement one, but one that actually is effective for the workforce. And I think all of that is embedded in our definition. I'm happy to share that with you if you want to post it online or anything like that. But
definitely.
If we could have that stuck up in corporations, around boardrooms around the world, and we could live by that, the world would be, we think, a better place. So, yeah.
So, Anna, because you are now, again, I love this concept that you are have been in South Africa and in Netherlands or Holland. Like, the question about this, when leaders, they have to, what I was asking about, like, you have something in your rucksack. So have you come across a difference? Because I guess that we are just the same. It doesn't matter where we are. We all have something. We are always fighting. Like, we are afraid of spiders, so we are, it's just like we have all our little things. Have you encountered something that you find interesting because you have been living in two worlds?
I think let's start with the commonalities. I think it is human nature to sometimes pay lip service to initiatives like diversity, equity, belonging, or we really value our generational employees. So I think it's very easy to say it because it's the politically correct thing to do, or that's the band-aid way to do. But to live that and to make that a business reality is much more difficult. And I think both continents are probably struggling, and we're not necessarily in the mature phases of creating a business case around that or infiltrating that through at all levels of the organization. We are at an awareness phase. So we're measuring it based on targets and quotas, etc., but we haven't really realized if we do that properly, authentically, how can we make money from that, and how can we create a bigger impact in society? So I think that's the one thing I wanted to say, that's straddling both components. How serious are we really about creating people-first organizations? And then secondly, previously I've written a blog article looking at the top 10 countries in the European Union. And there was one commonality amongst all of them. They were the highest value traded organizations in the 2024 stats. And what we find there is that those organizations share one thing in common, and that was a culture of well-being. So employees feel that they were listened to, they felt that their leaders are authentically supporting their well-being, and also workplaces that create a people-first organization. Similar to what we found the best workplace during Corona were those workplaces where leaders were authentic in terms of providing the support and availability for the employees. Workplace engagement actually increased during those times. So I think the lessons that we've learned, we must continuing living and translating in our workplaces today, and not put a lip service, not put band-aid, to really create the business cases about that and be authentic for what we're standing for in organizations.
Wow, this has been, it's almost an hour, and it's just like time flies when you're having fun. I think we could talk all day, but where have you posted your research? Where can you put it on the Facebook? No, on LinkedIn and Facebook, whatever. Can we just post this, your blog, Anna? Is it in Dutch or is it in English?
It's in English, so
so we can read it. Well,
we can share.
Well, we have all friends in Google Translate, so that's our common uncle or niece. So, but what can you any final big takings that you want to share with us, or something because as ever, this well-being is amazing stuff. If we don't focus on it, what will happen? why is it that we feel as a person that my well-being, if nobody, like I'm trying to take care of myself, but I'm stressed, I'm this, I'm that, and I burn out. And people say, oh, get a grip of life, and like pull up your pants and blah, blah, blah. Like any big takes.
I think maybe I'll go first quickly. I think to really simplify things, and this is an oversimplification, but if you look at a lot of the behavioral economics literature, there's so much power to giving people carrots instead of sticks. Okay, there's an abuse of one's position in beating others with sticks, and there's sometimes an old school thinking around it. But it's not any different to maybe your child is struggling with their mathematics homework. You can hit them on the back of the head and call them stupid, or you can sit down and empower them to actually understand the principles and so on. So maybe a bad analogy, but the same thing with your employees. Now, if you are not dealing in carrots and you're dealing only in sticks, i.e. the timesheets, or how long did you sit in your cubicle for, or, oh, you've taken far too much family responsibility leave, how dare you, we don't care that your child has a terminal disease, or whatever it might be. Okay, when we deal in carrots, that is literally infused in the whole definition that I mentioned earlier and that I'll share with you. And I think that also speaks to the empathy thing. Are we treating others the way we'd want to be treated? And human beings are not drones. They're not robots. They're not machines. And they spend only 30% of their lives at work, sometimes a little less. So what's happening outside of that 30% that we're not aware of or that we don't currently care about? And that's what really matters, to create that sense of belonging, togetherness, connectedness, community, well-being, and then ultimately what you're concerned with, happiness. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Anna Rosa, what is your like?
I'd love to add to that, and I think very much what Sean was saying. For me, it's very simple. It's about creating a sustainable world, and to use your terms, a world full of well-being. And I think it's everything connected. Individuals influences teams, teams influence individuals, teams individuals influence organizations, organizations influence individuals. We influences the community. So it's this open system of influencing. So it's not only the individual, we're all working together and we co-create this happiness, the world, making the world a better place. And I really do think intervening at a well-being level is a critical psychological component for making that change in a very practical way happen. And there's different role players. Organizations has got such a huge responsibility to create that change and to make the world a better place in their industry, in their countries, in their continents. And it's also about being an ambassador. How can we show up to be an ambassadors of well-being to both create the business case, because I do think that is important. That's the reason why corporate organizations are there, but also to make it in a way that we are sustainable and that we forever utilize the energy and respect the energy of our most valuable resources.
Boom! Mic drop. That was fantastic. So when and what or how can people, are they like, you are both on LinkedIn, you are like, how can we, we have to put this up and we have to put the research or snippets of it, or like, I'm so thankful, guys. It's just, I love this. I as always, like for the 9th time in these interviews or these sessions, I have goosebumps because I'm so like, and then I will go down and talk to my wife and I'm just like, oh, they said this and they said that. And, oh, this is so interesting. So just thank you. And like, it's unbelievable for me to meet 2 people from South Africa. It's just like, yay. So thank you very much. And just keep on doing everything that you're doing. And just, we are on a mission. And well-being is the name of the game. And as my colleague in Netherlands, he said, happiness is the aim, culture is the game. So just thank you. And thank you.
Thank you. And please feel free to tag us. We will respond And then folks can get our LinkedIn contacts. And we'll also, of course, post at least this definition, but also some links to the research if that's what you'd like. And yeah, thanks for having us both. I mean, it's been a pleasure. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to share our story. We really appreciate. Lovely to speak to you.
Yes, thank you. The only thing I regret now is that I didn't put HR in front of my name, Mr. Héðinn, or like, because you both have doctor. Oh, I'm so ridiculous. But thank you very much. So, and have a great weekend.